At this time Columbus, according to the portrait of him given by his biographer Washington Irving, was a tall man of robust and noble presence. His face was long, he had an aquiline nose, high cheekbones, eyes clear and full of fire. He had a bright complexion, and his face was much covered with freckles. He was a truly Christian man, and it was with the liveliest faith that he fulfilled all the duties of the Catholic religion. At the time when Christopher Columbus was in correspondence with the astronomer Toscanelli, he learnt that the latter, at the request of Alfonso V, King of Portugal, had sent to the king a learned memoir upon the possibility of reaching the Indies by the western route. Columbus was consulted and supported the ideas of Toscanelli with all his influence, but without result, for the King of Portugal, who was engaged at the time in war with Spain, died without having been able to give any attention to maritime discoveries. His successor, John Roman II, adopted the plans of Columbus and Toscanelli with enthusiasm. At the same time, with most reprehensible cunning, he tried to deprive these two savants of the benefit of their proposition. Without telling them, he sent out a caravel to attempt this great enterprise and to reach China by crossing the Atlantic. But he had not reckoned upon the inexperience of his pilots, nor upon the violence of the storms which they might encounter. The result was that some days after their departure, a hurricane brought back to Lisbon the sailors of the Portuguese king. Columbus was justly wounded by this unworthy action and felt that he could not reckon upon a king who had so deceived him. His wife being dead, he left Spain with his son Diego towards the end of the year 1484. It is thought that he went to Genoa and to Venice, where his projects of transoceanic navigation were but badly received. Columbus knocks at a convent door. Columbus knocks at a convent door. However it may have been, in 1485 we find him again in Spain. This great man was poor, without resources. He traveled on foot, carrying Diego, his little son of 10 years old, in his arms. From this period of his life, history follows him step by step. She no more loses sight of him, and she has preserved to posterity the smallest incidents of this grand existence. We find Columbus arrived in Andalusia, only half a league from the port of Palos. Destitute and dying of hunger, he knocked at the door of a Franciscan convent dedicated to Santa Maria de Rabida and asked for a little bread and water for his poor child and for himself. The superior of the convent, Juan Perez de Marchena, gave hospitality to the unfortunate traveler. He questioned him and was surprised by the nobleness of his language, but still more astonished was he by the boldness of the ideas of Columbus, who made the good father the confidant of his aspirations. For several months, the wandering sailor remained in this hospitable convent. Some of the monks were learned men and interested themselves about him and his projects. They studied his plans. They mentioned him to some of the well-known navigators of the time, and we must give them the credit of having been the first to believe in the genius of Christopher Columbus. Juan Perez showed still greater kindness. He offered to take upon himself the charge of the education of Diego, and he gave to Columbus a letter of recommendation addressed to the confessor of the Queen of Castile. This confessor, prior of the monastery of Prado, was deep in the confidence of Ferdinand and Isabella, but he did not approve of the projects of the Genoese navigator, and he rendered him no service whatever with his royal penitent. Columbus must still resign himself to wait. He went to live at Cordova, where the court was soon to come, and for livelihood he resumed his trade of picture seller. Is it possible to quote from the lives of illustrious men an instance of a more trying existence than this of the great navigator? Could ill fortune have assailed any man with more cruel blows? But this indomitable, indefatigable man of genius, rising up again after each trial, did not despair. He felt within him the sacred fire of genius. He worked on unceasingly. He visited influential persons, spreading his ideas and defending them, and combating all objections with the most heroic energy. At length, he obtained the protection of the great Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo, Pedro González de Mendoza, and thanks to him, was admitted into the presence of the King and Queen of Spain. Christopher Columbus must have imagined himself now at the end of all his troubles. Ferdinand and Isabella received his project favorably and caused it to be submitted for examination to a council of learned men, consisting of bishops and monks who were gathered together ad hoc in a Dominican convent at Salamanca. But the unfortunate pleader was not yet at the end of his vicissitudes. In this meeting at Salamanca, all his judges were against him. The truth was that his ideas interfered with the intolerant religious notions of the 15th century. The fathers of the Church had denied the sphericity of the earth, and since the earth was not round, they declared that a voyage of circumnavigation was absolutely contrary to the Bible, and could not therefore, on any logical theory, be undertaken. Besides, said these theologians, if anyone should ever succeed in descending into the other hemisphere, how could he ever mount up again into this one? This manner of arguing was a very formidable one at this period, for Christopher Columbus saw himself, in consequence, almost accused of heresy, the most unpardonable crime which could be committed in these intolerant countries. He escaped any evil consequences from the hostile disposition of the council, but the execution of his project was again adjourned. Building a caravel. Building a caravel. Long years passed away. The unfortunate man of genius, despairing of success in Spain, sent his brother to England to make an offer of his services to the king, Henry Roman VII, but it is probable that the king gave no answer. Then Christopher Columbus turned again with unabated perseverance to Ferdinand, but Ferdinand was at this time engaged in a war of extermination against the Moors, and it was not when he had chased the Moors from Spain that he was able again to listen to the solicitations of the Genoese sailor. This time the affair was thoroughly considered, and the king consented to the enterprise. But Columbus, as is the manner of proud natures, wished to impose his own conditions. They bargained over that which should enrich Spain. Columbus, in disgust, was without doubt ready to quit, and forever this ungrateful country, but Isabella, touched by the thought of the unbelievers of Asia, whom she hoped to convert to the Catholic faith, ordered Columbus to be recalled, and then acceded to all his demands. Columbus was in the 56th year of his age when he signed a treaty with the King of Spain at Santa Fe on the 17th of April, 1492, being 18 years after he had first conceived his project, and 7 years from the time of his quitting the monastery of Palos. By this solemn convention, the dignity of High Admiral was to belong to Columbus in all the lands which he might discover, and this dignity was to descend in perpetuity to his heirs and successors. He was named viceroy and governor of the new possessions which he hoped to conquer in the rich countries of Asia, and 1/10 part of the pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, provisions, and merchandise of whatever kind, which might be acquired in any manner whatsoever within the limits of his jurisdiction, was of right to belong to him. All was arranged, and at length Columbus was to put his cherished projects in execution. But let us repeat, he had no thought of meeting with the New World, of the existence of which he had not the faintest suspicion. His aim was to explore the East by the West, and to pass by the way of the West to the land whence come the spices. One may even aver that Columbus died in the belief that he had arrived at the shores of Asia and never knew himself that he had made the discovery of America. But this in no way lessens his glory. The meeting with the new continent was but an accident. The real cause of the immortal renown of Columbus was that audacity of genius which induced him to brave the dangers of an unknown ocean, to separate himself afar from those familiar shores, which until now navigators had never ventured to quit, to adventure himself upon the waves of the Atlantic Ocean in the frail ships of the period, which the first tempest might engulf, to launch himself, in a word, upon the deep darkness of an unknown sea. The preparations began, Columbus entering into an arrangement with some rich navigators of Palos, the 3 brothers Pinzon, who made the necessary advances for defraying the expenses of fitting out the ships. 3 caravels, named the Gallega, the Nina, and the Pinta, were equipped in the port of Palos. The Gallega was destined to carry the admiral, who changed her name to the Santa Maria. The Pinta was commanded by Martin Alonso Pinzon, and the Nina by his 2 brothers, Francis Martin and Vincent Yanez Pinzon. It was difficult to man the ships, sailors generally being frightened at the enterprise, but at last the captains succeeded in getting together 120 men, and on Friday, August 3, 1492, the admiral crossing at 8 o'clock in the morning the bar of Saltes, off the town of Huelva in Andalusia, adventured himself with his 3 half-decked caravels upon the Atlantic waves. Chapter 2. Christopher Columbus. First voyage, the Great Canary, Gomera magnetic variation, symptoms of revolt, land, San Salvador, taking possession, Conception, Fernandina or Great Exuma, Isabella or Long Island, the Mucaras, Cuba, description of the island, archipelago of Notre Dame, Hispaniola or San Domingo, Tortuga Island, the cacique on board the Santa Maria, the caravel of Columbus goes aground and cannot be floated off, island of Monte Cristi, return, Tempest, arrival in Spain, homage rendered to Christopher Columbus. During the first day's voyage, the Admiral, the title by which he is usually known in the various accounts of his exploits, bearing directly southwards, sailed 45 miles before sunset. Turning then to the southeast, he steered for the Canaries in order to repair the Pinta, which had unshipped her rudder, an accident caused perhaps by the ill will of the steersman who dreaded the voyage. 10 days later Columbus cast anchor before the Great Canary Island, where the rudder of the caravel was repaired. 19 days afterwards he arrived before Gomera, where the inhabitants assured him of the existence of an unknown land in the west of the archipelago. He did not leave Gomera until the 6th of September. He had received warning that 3 Portuguese ships awaited him in the open sea, with the intention of barring his passage. However, without taking any heed of this news, he put to sea, cleverly avoided meeting his enemies, and steering directly westward, he lost all sight of land. During the voyage, the Admiral took care to conceal from his companions the true distance traversed each day. He made it appear less than it really was in the daily abstracts of his observations, that he might not add to the fear already felt by the sailors, by letting them know the real distance which separated them from Europe. Each day he watched the compasses with attention, and it is to him we owe the discovery of the magnetic variation, of which he took account in his calculations. The pilots, however, were much disturbed on seeing the compasses all northwesters, as they expressed it. Christopher Columbus on board his caravel. Christopher Columbus on board his caravel. On the 14th of September, the sailors saw a swallow and some tropic birds. The sight of these birds was an evidence of land being near, for they do not usually fly more than about 70 miles out to sea. The temperature was very mild, the weather magnificent, the wind blew from the east and wafted the caravels in the desired direction. But it was exactly this continuance of east wind which frightened the greater part of the sailors, who saw in this persistence, so favorable for the outward voyage, the promise of a formidable obstacle to their return home. On the 16th of September, some tufts of seaweed, still fresh, were seen floating on the waves. But no land was to be seen, and this seaweed might possibly indicate the presence of submarine rocks, and not of the shores of a continent. On the 17th, 35 days after the departure of the expedition, floating weeds were frequently seen, and upon one mass of weed was found a live crayfish, a sure sign this of the proximity of land. During the following days, a large number of birds, such as gannets, sea swallows, and tropic birds, flew around the caravels. Columbus turned their presence to account as a means of reassuring his companions, who were beginning to be terribly frightened at not meeting with land after 6 weeks of sailing. His own confidence never abated, but putting firm trust in God, he often addressed energetic words of comfort to those around him, and made them each evening chant the Salve Regina or some other hymn to the Virgin. At the words of this heroic man, so noble, so sure of himself, so superior to all human weaknesses, the courage of the sailors revived, and they again went onwards. We can well imagine how anxiously both officers and men scanned the western horizon towards which they were steering. Each one had a pecuniary motive for wishing to be the first to descry the new continent, King Ferdinand having promised a reward of 10,000 maravedis, or £400 to the first discoverer. The latter days of the month of September were enlivened by the presence of numerous large birds, petrels, man-o'-war birds, and daimios, flying in couples, a sign that they were not far away from home. So Columbus retained his unshaken conviction that land could not be far off. On the 1st of October, the admiral announced to his companions that they had made 1272 miles to the west since leaving Faro. In reality, the distance traversed exceed miles, and of this Columbus was quite aware, but persisted in his policy of disguising the truth in this particular. On the 7th of October, the crews were excited by hearing discharges of musketry from the Nina, the commanders of which, the two brothers Pinzon, thought they had descried the land. They soon found, however, that they had been mistaken. Still, on their representing that they had seen some paroquets flying in a southwesterly direction, the admiral consented to change his route so far as to steer some points to the south, a change which had happy consequences in the future, for had they continued to run directly westward, the caravels would have been aground upon the great Bahama bank and would probably have been altogether destroyed. Still the ardently desired land did not appear. Each evening the sun, as it went down, dipped behind an interminable horizon of water. The crews who had several times been the victims of an optical illusion now began to murmur against Columbus, the Genoese, the foreigner, who had enticed them so far away from their country. Some symptoms of mutiny had already shown themselves on board the vessels, when, on the 10th of October, the sailors openly declared that they would go no further. In treating of this part of the voyage, the historians would seem to have drawn somewhat upon their imagination. They narrate scenes of serious import which took place upon the admiral's caravel, the sailors going so far as even to threaten his life. They say also that the recriminations ended by a kind of arrangement, granting a respite of 3 days to Columbus, at the end of which time, should land not have been then discovered, the fleet was to set out on its return to Europe. All these statements we may look upon as pure fiction. There is nothing in the accounts given by Columbus himself which lends them the smallest credibility. But it has been needful to touch upon them, for nothing must be omitted relating to the great Genoese navigator, and some amount of legend mixed up with history does not ill beseem the grand figure of Christopher Columbus. Still, it is an undoubted fact that there was much murmuring on board the caravels, but it would seem that the crews, cheered by the words of the admiral and by his brave attitude in the midst of uncertainty, did not refuse to do their duty in working the ships. On the 11th of October, the admiral noticed alongside of his vessel a reed still green floating upon the top of a large wave. At the same time, the crew of the Pinta hoisted on board another reed, a small board, and a little stick, which appeared to have been cut with an instrument of iron. It was evident that human hands had been employed upon these things. Almost at the same moment, the men of the Nina perceived a branch of some thorny tree covered with blossoms. At all this, everyone rejoiced exceedingly. There could be no doubt now of the proximity of the coast. Night fell over the sea. The Pinta, the best sailor of the 3 vessels, was leading. Already, Columbus himself and one Rodrigo Sanchez, controller of the expedition, had thought they had seen a light moving amidst the shadows of the horizon, when a sailor named Rodrigo, on board the Pinta, cried out, "Land, land!" What must have been the feelings in the breast of Columbus at that moment? What must have been the feelings in the breast of Columbus at that moment? What must have been the feelings in the breast of Columbus at that moment? Never had any man, since the first creation of the human race, experienced a similar emotion to that now felt by the great navigator. Perhaps even it is allowable to think that the eye which first saw this new continent was indeed that of the admiral himself. But what matters it? The glory of Columbus consisted not in the having arrived. His glory was in the having set out. It was at 2 o'clock in the morning that the land was first seen, when the caravels were not 2 hours' sail away from it. At once all the crews, deeply moved, joined in singing together the Salve Regina. With the first rays of the sun they saw a little island 6 miles to windward of them. It was one of the Bahama group. Columbus named it San Salvador, and immediately falling on his knees, he began to repeat the hymn of St. Ambrose and St. Augustine, Te Deum laudamus, Te Deum confitema. At this moment, some naked savages appeared upon the newly discovered coast. Columbus had his long boat lowered, and got into it with Alonso and Yanez Pinzon, the controller Rodrigo, the secretary Discovido, and some others. He landed upon the shore, carrying in his hand the royal banner, whilst the 2 captains bore between them the green banner of the cross, upon which were interlaced the initials of Ferdinand and Isabella. Then the admiral solemnly took possession of the island in the name of the King and Queen of Spain and caused a record of the act to be drawn up. During this ceremony, the natives came round Columbus and his companions. Charton gives the account of the scene in the very words of Columbus. Desiring to inspire them, the natives, with friendship for us, and being persuaded on seeing them that they would confide the more readily in us, and be the better disposed towards embracing our holy faith, if we used mildness in persuading them, rather than if we had recourse to force, I caused to be given to several amongst them colored caps, and also glass beads, which they put around their necks. I added various other articles of small value. They testified great joy, and showed so much gratitude that we marveled greatly at it. When we were re-embarking, they swam towards us, to offer us paraquets, balls of cotton thread, zagueys or long darts, and many other things. In exchange we gave them some small glass beads, little bells, and other objects. They gave us all they had, but they appeared to me to be very poor. The men and women both were as naked as when they were born. Amongst those whom we saw, one woman was rather young, and none of the men appeared to be more than 30 years of age. They were well made, their figures handsome, and their faces agreeable. Their hair, coarse as that of a horse's tail, hung down in front as low as their eyebrows. Behind it formed a long mass, which they never cut. There are some who paint themselves with a blackish pigment, their natural color being neither black nor white, but similar to that of the inhabitants of the Canary Islands. Some paint themselves with white, some with red, or any other color, either covering the whole body with it, or the whole face, or perhaps only the eyes or the nose. They do not carry arms like our people, and do not even know what they are. When I showed them some swords, they laid hold of them by the blades and cut their fingers. They have no iron, their zagueys are sticks. The tip is not of iron, but sometimes made of a fish tooth or of some other hard substance. They have much grace in their movements. I remarked that several had scars upon their bodies, and I asked them by means of signs how they had been wounded. They answered in the same manner, that the inhabitants of the neighboring islands had come to attack them and make them prisoners, and that they had defended themselves. I thought then, and I still think, that they must have come from the mainland to make them prisoners for slaves. They would be faithful and gentle servants. They seem to have the power of repeating quickly what they hear. I am persuaded that they might be converted to Christianity without difficulty, for I believe that they belong to no sect. When Columbus returned on board, several of the savages swam after his boat. The next day, the 13th, they came in crowds around the ships, on board of enormous canoes shaped out of the trunks of trees. They were guided by means of a kind of baker's shovel, and some of the canoes were capable of holding 40 men. Several natives wore little plates of gold hanging from their nostrils. They appeared much surprised at the arrival of the strangers, and quite believed that these white men must have fallen from the skies. It was with a mixture of respect and curiosity that they touched the garments of the Spaniards, considering them doubtless a kind of natural plumage. The scarlet coat of the admiral excited their admiration above everything, and it was evident they looked upon Columbus as a paraquet of a superior species. At once, they seemed to recognize him as the chief amongst the strangers. So Columbus and his followers visited this new island of San Salvador. They were never tired of admiring the beauty of its situation, its magnificent groves, its running streams, and verdant meadows. The fauna of the island offered little variety. Paraquets of radiant plumage abounded amongst the trees, but they appeared to be the only species of birds upon the island. San Salvador presented an almost flat plateau of which no mountain broke the uniformity. A small lake occupied the center of the island. The explorers imagined that San Salvador must contain great mineral riches, since the inhabitants were adorned with ornaments of gold. But was this precious metal derived from the island itself? Upon this point, the admiral questioned one of the natives, and succeeded in learning from him by means of signs that in turning the island and sailing towards the south, the admiral would find a country of which the king possessed great vessels of gold and immense riches. The next morning at daybreak, Columbus gave orders to have the ships prepared for sea. He set sail and steered towards the continent of which the natives had spoken, which, as he imagined, could be none other than Cipango. Here an important observation must be made, showing the state of geographical knowledge at this period, viz., that Columbus now believed himself to have arrived at Asia, Cipango being the name given by Marco Polo to Japan. This error of the admiral, shared in by all his companions, was not rectified for many years afterwards, and thus, as we have already remarked, the great navigator, after 4 successive voyages to the islands, died without knowing that he had discovered a new world. It is beyond doubt that the sailors of Columbus, and Columbus himself, imagined that they had arrived, during that night of the 12th October, 1492, either at Japan or China or the Indies. This is the reason why America so long bore the name of the Western Indies, and why the aborigines of this continent, in Brazil and in Mexico, as well as in the United States, are still classed under the general appellation of Indians. So Columbus dreamt only of reaching the shores of Japan. He coasted along San Salvador, exploring its western side. The natives, running down to the shore, offered him water and cassava bread, made from the root of a plant called the yucca. Several times the admiral landed upon the coast at different points, and with a sad want of humanity, he carried away some of the natives, that he might take them with him to Spain. Poor men, already the strangers began to tear them from their country. It would not be long before they began to sell them. At last the caravels lost sight of San Salvador and were again upon the wide ocean. Fortune had favored Columbus in thus guiding him into the center of one of the most beautiful archipelagos which the world contains. These new lands which he discovered were as a casket of precious stones, which needed only to be opened, and the hands of the discoverer were full of treasures. On the 15th October, at sunset, the flotilla came to anchor near the western point of a second island, at a distance of only 15 miles from San Salvador. This island was named Conception. On the morrow, the admiral landed upon the shore, having his men well armed for fear of surprise. The natives, however, proved to be of the same race as those of San Salvador, and gave a kind welcome to the Spaniards. A southeasterly wind having arisen, Columbus soon put to sea again, and 27 miles further westward, he discovered a third island, which he called Fernandina, but which now goes by the name of the Great Exuma. All night they lay to, and next day, the 17th October, large native canoes came off to the vessels. The relations with the natives were excellent, the savages peacefully exchanging fruit and small balls of cotton for glass beads, tambourines, needles, which took their fancy greatly, and some molasses, of which they appeared very fond. These natives of Fernandina wore some clothing, and appeared altogether more civilized than those of San Salvador. They inhabited houses made in the shape of tents, and having high chimneys. The interiors of these dwellings were remarkably clean and well kept. The western side of the island, with its deeply indented shore, formed a grand natural harbor, capable of containing 100 vessels. But Fernandina did not afford the riches so much coveted by the Spaniards as spoils to take back to Europe. There were no gold mines here. The natives who were on board the flotilla always spoke, however, of a larger island situated to the south end, called Sayamito, in which the precious metal was found. Columbus steered in the direction indicated, and during the night of Friday, the 19th of October, he cast anchor near this Sayamito, calling it Isabella. In modern maps, it goes by the name of Long Island. According to the natives of San Salvador, there was a powerful king in this island, but the admiral for several days awaited in vain the advent of this great personage. He did not show himself. The island of Isabella was beautiful of aspect, with its clear lakes and thick forests. The Spaniards were never tired of admiring the new type of nature presented to their view, and of which the intense verdure was wonderful to European eyes. Paroquets in innumerable flocks were flying amongst the thick trees, and great lizards, doubtless iguanas, glided with rapid movements in the high grass. The inhabitants of the island fled at first at the sight of the foreigners, but soon becoming bolder, they trafficked with the Spaniards in the productions of their country. Still Columbus held firmly to the notion of reaching the shores of Japan. The natives had mentioned to him a large island a little to the west, which they called Cuba, and this, the admiral supposed, must form part of the kingdom of Cipango. He felt little doubt, but that he would soon arrive at the town of Quinsay or Hangti Chufu, formerly the capital of China. With this object, as soon as the winds permitted, the fleet weighed anchor. On Thursday, the 25th of October, 7 or 8 islands lying in a straight line were sighted. These were probably the Mucaras. Columbus did not stop to visit them, and on the Sunday he came in sight of Cuba. The caravels were moored in a river, to which the Spaniards gave the name of San Salvador. After a short stay, they sailed again towards the west, and entered a harbor situated at the mouth of a large river, which was afterwards called the harbor of Las Nuvitas del Principe. Numerous palm trees were growing upon the shores of the island, having leaves so broad that only one was required for roofing a native hut. The natives had fled at the approach of the Spaniards, who found upon the shore idols of female form, tame birds, bones of animals, also dumb dogs, and some fishing instruments. The Cuban savages, however, were ready to be enticed like the others, and they consented to barter their goods with the Spaniards. Columbus believed himself to be now on the mainland, and only a few leagues from Hangti Chufu, this idea being so rooted in his mind that he even busied himself in dispatching some presents to the great Khan of China. On the 2nd of November, he desired one of the officers of his ship, and a Jew who could speak Hebrew, Chaldee, and Arabic, to set out to seek this native monarch. The ambassadors, carrying with them strings of beads, and having 6 days given to them for the fulfillment of their mission, started, taking a route leading towards the interior of this so-called continent. In the meantime, Columbus explored for nearly 6 miles a splendid river which flowed beneath the shade of woods of odoriferous trees. The inhabitants freely bartered their goods with the Spaniards and frequently mentioned to them a place named Bohio, where gold and pearls might be obtained in abundance. They added that men lived there who had dogs' heads and who fed upon human flesh. The admiral's envoys returned to the port on the 6th of November after a 4 days' absence. 2 days had sufficed to bring them to a village composed of about 50 huts, where they were received with every mark of respect, the natives kissing their feet and hands and taking them for deities descended from the skies. Among other details of native customs, they reported that both men and women smoked tobacco by means of a forked pipe, drawing up the smoke through their nostrils. These savages were acquainted with the secret of obtaining fire by rubbing briskly 2 pieces of wood against each other. Cotton was found in large quantities in the houses, made up into the form of tents, one of these containing as much as 11,000 pounds of the material. As to the Grand Khan, they saw no vestige of him. Another consequence of the error of Columbus must be noticed here, one which, according to Irving, changed the whole series of his discoveries. He believed himself to be on the coast of Asia and therefore looked upon Cuba as a portion of that continent. In consequence, he never thought of making the tour of Cuba, but decided on returning towards the east. Now, had he not been deceived on this occasion, and had he continued to follow the same direction as at first, the results of his enterprise would have been greatly modified. He might then have drifted towards Florida at the southeastern point of North America, or he might have run direct to Mexico. In this latter case, instead of ignorant and savage natives, what would he have found? The inhabitants of the great Aztec Empire, of the half-civilized kingdom of Montezuma. There he would have seen towns, armies, enormous wealth, and his role would no doubt have been the same as that afterwards played by Fernando Cortes. But it was not to be thus, and the admiral, persevering in his mistake, directed his flotilla towards the east, weighing anchor on the 12th of November, 1492. Columbus tacked in and out along the Cuban coast. He saw the 2 mountains, Crystal and Moa. He explored a harbor to which he gave the name of Puerto del Principe, and an archipelago which he called the Sea of Nuestra Senora. Each night the fishermen's fires were seen upon the numerous islands, the inhabitants of which lived upon spiders and huge worms. Several times the Spaniards landed upon different points of the coast, and there planted the cross as a sign of taking possession of the country. The natives often spoke to the admiral about a certain island of Babque, where gold abounded, and thither Columbus resolved to go, but Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the Pinta, the best sailor of the 3 ships, was beforehand with him, and at daybreak on the 21st of November, he had completely disappeared from sight. The admiral was very angry at this separation, his feelings on the subject appearing plainly in his narrative, where he says, "Pinzon has said and done to me many like things." Continuing his exploration of the coast of Cuba, Columbus discovered the Bay of Moa, the Point of Mangle, Point Vise, and the harbor of Baracoa, but nowhere did he meet with cannibals, although the huts of the natives were often to be seen adorned with human skulls, a sight which appeared to give great satisfaction to the islanders on board the fleet. On the following days, they saw the Boma River, and the caravels, doubling the point of Los Azules, found themselves upon the eastern part of the island, whose coast they had now reconnoitered for a distance of 375 miles. But Columbus, instead of continuing his route to the south, turned off to the east, and on the 5th of December perceived a large island called by the natives Bohio. This was Haiti or San Domingo. In the evening, the Nina, by the admiral's orders, entered a harbor which was named Port Mary. It is situated at the northwestern extremity of the island, and, with the cape near which it lies, is now called St. Nicholas. The next day the Spaniards discovered a number of headlands and an islet called Tortuga Island. Everywhere on the appearance of the ships, the Indian canoes took to flight. The island, along which they were now coasting, appeared very large and very high, from which latter peculiarity it gained, later on, its name of Haiti, which signifies high land. The coast was explored by the Spaniards as far as Mosquito Bay. Its natural features, its plains and hills, its plants and the birds which fluttered amongst the beautiful trees of the island, all recalled to the memory the landscapes of Castile, and for this reason Columbus named it Hispaniola or Spanish Island. The inhabitants were extremely timid and distrustful. They fled away into the interior, and no communication could be held with them. Some sailors, however, succeeded in capturing a young woman, whom they carried on board with them. She was young and rather pretty. The admiral gave her, besides rings and beads, some clothing, of which she had great need, and after most generous treatment, he sent her back to shore. This good conduct had the result of taming the natives, and the next day, when 9 of the sailors, well armed, ventured as far as 16 miles inland, they were received with respect, the savages running to them in crowds and offering them everything which their country produced. The sailors returned to the ships enchanted with their excursion. The interior of the island they had found rich in cotton plants, mastic trees and aloes, while a fine river, named afterwards the Three Rivers, flowed gently along its limpid course. On December 15th, Columbus again set sail and was carried by the wind towards Tortuga Island, upon which he saw a navigable stream of water and a valley so beautiful that he called it the Vale of Paradise. The day following, having tacked into a deep gulf, an Indian was seen who, notwithstanding the violence of the wind, was skillfully maneuvering a light canoe. This Indian was invited to come on board, was loaded with presents by the admiral, and then put on shore again at one of the harbors of Hispaniola, now called the Puerto de Paz. This kindness tended to attach the natives to the admiral, and from that day they came in numbers round the caravels. Their king came with them, a strong, vigorous, and somewhat stout young man of 20 years of age. He was naked, like his subjects of both sexes, who showed him much respect, but with no appearance of servility. Columbus ordered royal honors to be rendered to him, and in return the king, or rather cacique, informed the admiral that the provinces to the east abounded in gold. Columbus named it the Vale of Paradise. Columbus named it the Vale of Paradise. Next day another cacique arrived, offering to place all the treasures of his country at the service of the Spaniards. He was present at a fete in honor of the Virgin Mary that Columbus caused to be celebrated with great pomp on board his vessel, which was gaily dressed with flags on the occasion. The cacique dined at the admiral's table, apparently enjoying the repast. After he had himself tasted of the different viands and beverages, he sent the dishes and goblets to the members of his suite. He had good manners, spoke little, but showed great politeness. After the feast, he gave the admiral some thin leaves of gold, while Columbus, on his side, presented him with some coins, upon which were engraved the portraits of Ferdinand and Isabella, and after explaining to him by signs that these were the representations of the most powerful sovereigns in the world, he caused the royal banners of Castile to be displayed before the savage prince. When night fell, the cacique retired, highly delighted with his visit, and on his departure he was saluted with a salvo of artillery. On the day following, the crews, before quitting this hospitable coast, set up a large cross in the middle of the little town. In issuing from the gulf formed by Tortuga Island and Hispaniola, they discovered several harbors, capes, bays, and rivers. At the point of limb, a a small island which Columbus named St. Thomas, and finally, an enormous harbor safe and sheltered, hidden between the island and the Bay of Acull, and to which access was given by a canal surrounded by high mountains covered with trees. The admiral often disembarked upon this coast, the natives receiving him as an ambassador from heaven and imploring him to remain among them. Columbus gave them quantities of little bells, brass rings, glass beads, and other toys, which they eagerly accepted. A cacique named Guacanagari, reigning over the province of Marion, sent to the admiral a belt adorned with the figure of an animal with large ears, of which the nose and tongue were made of beaten gold. Gold appeared to be abundant in the island, and the natives soon brought a considerable quantity of it to the strangers. The inhabitants of this part of Hispaniola seemed to be superior in intelligence and appearance to those of that portion of the island which had been first visited. In the opinion of Columbus, the paint, red, black, or white, with which the natives covered their bodies served to protect them from sunstroke. The huts of these savages were pretty and well built. Upon Columbus questioning them as to the country which produced gold, they always indicated one towards the east, a country which they called Cibao, and which the admiral continued to identify with Cipango or Japan. On Christmas Day, a serious accident occurred to the admiral's caravel, the first damage sustained in this hitherto prosperous voyage. An inexperienced steersman was at the helm of the Santa Maria during an excursion outside the Gulf of St. Thomas. Night came on, and he allowed the vessel to be caught in some currents which threw her upon the rocks. The caravel grounded, and her rudders stuck fast. The admiral, awakened by the shock, ran upon deck. He ordered an anchor to be fastened forward, by which the ship might warp herself off and so float again. The master and some of the sailors charged with the execution of this order jumped into the long boat, but seized with a sudden panic, they rowed away in haste to the Nina. Meantime the tide fell, and the Santa Maria ran further aground. It became necessary to cut away the masts to lighten her, and soon it was evident that everything on board must be removed to the other ship. The cacique Guacanagari, quite understanding the dangerous situation of the caravel, came with his brothers and other relations, accompanied by a great number of the Indians, and helped in unlading the ship. Thanks to this prince, not a single article of the cargo was stolen, and during the whole night, armed natives kept watch around the stores of provisions. The next day Guacanagari went on board the Nina to console the admiral and to place all his own possessions at his disposal, at the same time offering him a repast of bread, doe's flesh, fish, roots, and fruit. Columbus, much moved by these tokens of friendship, formed the design of founding an establishment on this island. With this purpose in view, he addressed himself to gain the hearts of the Indians by presents and kindness, and wishing also to give them an adequate notion of his power, he ordered the discharge of an arquebuse and a small cannon, of which the reports frightened the poor savages terribly. On December 26th, the Spaniards commenced the construction of a fort upon this part of the coast, the intention of the admiral being to leave there a certain number of men, with a year's provision of bread, wine, and seed, and to give them the long boat belonging to the Santa Maria. The works at the fort were pushed forward with rapidity. It was also on the 26th that they received news of the Pinta, which had been separated from the flotilla since November 21st. The natives announced that she was at anchor in a river at the extreme point of the island, but a canoe dispatched by Guacanagari returned without having found her. Then Columbus, not wishing to continue his explorations under the present conditions, since the loss of the Santa Maria, which could not be floated again, left him but one caravel, decided to return to Spain, and preparations for the departure began.